I try to imagine a fellow smarter than myself, and then I try to think, what would he do?
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. I am your host, Jesse Lawler, and this is the 90th episode of this podcast dedicated to the ongoing improvement of your own brain by any and all means at your disposal. In this 90th episode, we're going to be having a little bit of a flashback to our very first episode where one of the subjects under discussion was a drug called GHB, that's gamma-hydroxybutyric acid, which is a really super interesting drug. It has a favorable reputation in some areas, a horribly infamous reputation in others. It can be a stimulant in certain conditions and a depressant in other conditions. It is definitely worthy of digging into and getting a better understanding of, and we're going to be talking with an expert on GHB by the name of Dan Pardi. That's not party like my girl parties all the time, but P-A-R-D-I, who actually has a professional history with GHB and is currently a health and lifestyle blogger with dansplan.com. So that'll be the main interview. If you hang around until the very end of the episode, I'm going to tell you something that I don't necessarily condone, but I did think it was really clever. This is a method of drug administration, drug application, basically a way of getting a drug into your system that I just never heard of before, but is now being done in at least one place in a retail context. So it's not a pill, it's not an injection, it's something else. But that'll be in the ruthless listener retention gimmick. But first, as usual, let's kick things off with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts. This Week in Neuroscience.
So sometimes you hear about something and you're like, wait a minute, could that really work? And if that does really work, how come nobody thought of it till now? So there was a recent study done by a psychologist at University of Colorado at Denver, Christina Leggett, and she was looking at using something called subliminal priming to make people less likely to go after unhealthy foods. So foods that they might crave, maybe it's a Dunkin' Donut splurge or something like that, helping people that have a hard time with those cravings, maybe have the cravings not come on so strong. So what Leggett did in this study is she had 42 volunteers picture high-calorie foods like French fries or something like that, and asked the very leading question, so how much would you like to eat this right now? And of course, the people would think longingly about the food, and then she would very quickly flash a disgusting image at them, so like pictures of ants crawling over a pizza or a mutilated leg. These images were flashed so fast that it was a subliminal thing that would not be consciously registered by the brain, but could be picked up by the amygdala. So the emotion of disgust gets activated even though the subject isn't necessarily recognizing where that emotion is coming from. After this subliminal priming, thinking about those same foods did not lead to the same self-measured amount of craving on the part of the subjects. And these effects lasted 3 to 5 days later when they did follow-ups with the subjects and showed them the same food without the subliminal images. They still wanted those foods less, which is a really interesting finding because, we've been able to do subliminal images forever. And of course, now there might be some easier ways to quickly do this. You could think of like an Instagram-style app where somebody takes a photo of the food that they have a hard time resisting and then sees that subliminally juxtaposed with little creepy crawlies that they would hate. And even if it only makes resisting the craving marginally easier, it's still such an easy intervention for people to do with a mobile phone that they already have and one simple little app. It's kind of a cool idea if it's as simple as that. However, Jennifer Harris, a social psychologist at University of Connecticut, says that subliminal priming really needs to be subliminal for it to work. If people are aware of the stimuli, she says, they'll be able to counteract the effect with a conscious effort. But I don't know. If the whole point is that you're trying to help yourself resist these foods, then maybe you wouldn't be making that conscious effort. Anyway, just one study, but kind of a cool idea. And if you've been collecting pictures of cockroaches and mutilated legs and you just didn't know what to do with them, then, maybe there's an app you can load them into soon. Thank you to those of you who reached out over the course of this past week. A little bit of email, a little bit of Twitter. I'm actually doing something different this week. Since we publish on Fridays, I'm going to try to start taking my Fridays primarily off my laptop and do a little bit more physical world stuff. I actually will probably be tweeting a goodbye tweet at like 11:59 on Thursday night and then going offline or mostly offline for the better part of a day on Fridays and see how that works. Try to enforce a little bit more real world interactivity by yours truly, because I do tend to be a pretty computer-centric guy on a day in, day out basis, and that's always been my way. I'm one of these lucky people in that, given the amount of hours I stare at a computer screen, it's amazing that my eyesight has held up as well as it has. But let this not be a disincentive to anybody that wants to reach out on email, Twitter, or anything like that. It's not that I won't respond, it's just that I probably won't respond on Friday. And a reminder on behalf of the lovely and talented Miss Rhiannon Rowe to keep your email inbox warm and comfy with a subscription to the Smart Drug Smarts email newsletter, which you can quite easily sign up for at smartdrugsmarts.com or by texting SDS to the phone number 33733 if you are on a U.S. mobile phone. And one thing that we did not get posted quite in time last week was music recommendations for the musical tracks that Dr. James Eierman uses in his holotropic breathwork sessions. We did get those links. Those should be posted by the time you hear this on the episode number 89 page on the smartdrugsmarts.com website. So if you're looking for those and didn't find them, take a peek back and they should be there waiting for you. I spoke a couple days ago with Dr. Ken Ford from the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, who, if you remember, is no stranger to giant robots. And among several academic things that he sent me, he also sent me a link to a Kickstarter campaign for a team from the USA that has challenged a team from Japan to a battle of giant robots. I think it's fair to say that this is a Kickstarter that is probably going to be fully funded. Looks like they've just started it a couple of days ago, and they're already more than halfway to their $500,000 goal. We'll put a link to this in the show notes, but if there's one thing I think we can safely assume about the internet, it is that the internet will find a way to make giant fighting robots happen. But yeah, if you want to support this Kickstarter, you will find a link on smartdrugsmarts.com. And if you want to support Smart Drug Smarts, then an excellent way to do that, if you have not done so yet, is to check out the supplements that we recently released under the Axon Labs brand. They are called Nexus and Mitogen, both of which I'm proud to say are in my system even as I speak. Nexus is an aniracetam-based stack aimed at cognition, and Mitogen is more of an all-purpose physical stack aimed at mitochondrial health, but also definitely provides some cognitive uptick. So thanks so much. It's great to see that percolating in the world out there. Really appreciate the people that have tried it out so far, and I'm really excited to see now the sort of the second wave of orders from people that tried it and have used their first month's supply up and are now coming back for more. You can find Nexus and Mitogen at axonlabs.io, or you can go to smartdrugsmarts.com and look for the shop link in the main navigation bar.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So we are going to be talking with Dan Pardi, and we're going to be talking about GHB, that's gamma-hydroxybutyrate, which I think I got wrong earlier and said gamma-hydroxybutyric acid, which is chemically close but no cigar. But here to set us straight is Dan Pardi. Dan is a former Division I strength and training coach who clearly fell in love with research somewhere along the way, and in fact he tells us his background early in the interview, so I won't go too much into that, but it was a really interesting path that's led him to being the chief researcher and main blogger over at dansplan.com. He also does research with the Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences Department at Stanford. He works with Leiden University in the Netherlands, so definitely a man about town in the health space and really, really well-versed in GHB for reasons that he'll go into. I should say by way of preamble, GHB, as you'll hear, is quite difficult to get one's hands on if you're a U.S. citizen nowadays, so despite any enthusiasm that you might feel over the course of this interview, sort of temper that with a bit of reality because this stuff is not necessarily going to be easy to come by. This is a long interview. There's a lot to say about GHB, both as far as its chemical effects and its good, bad, and ugly history. So with no further ado, Dan Pardi and GHB.
So I was working at a pharmaceutical company called Orphan Medical, and Orphan is a company that was working with the FDA to develop drugs for what are called orphan diseases, which are diseases that have 200,000 people or fewer, and oftentimes then don't have the financial remuneration from development of drugs to incentivize pharmaceutical companies to develop therapies for them. Orphan said, okay, well, there's a lot of people in need. We're going to try to create some therapies for those people specifically. And they worked with the FDA to get breaks on development costs in order to do that. And at the time, they had been working with the FDA to develop a drug, GHB, or sodium oxybate. You'll hear me refer to it both ways. Sodium oxybate is the sodium salt of GHB. So once you consume it, it turns into GHB in the body. And it had such a rich history at that point, but that was my introduction. And I worked as a sales rep for a year, and I just got incredibly into the medication. And eventually I made a rare transition from a salesperson into somebody that was on more of the scientific side of things.
I gotta say, yeah, that is an unusual career switcheroo.
Yeah, so I I did not really follow what my sales organization exactly wanted me to do, in that I wasn't going out there and trying to, see 10 people a day. I actually would schedule longer sessions with the doctors, and so I could really answer their questions. But then I spent literally half of my day reading 1 to 3 articles on GHB. I got completely obsessed about it, just wanting to understand how it worked, and it was just fascinating to me in so many ways. So eventually I started to write a paper on my own. I would do it in cafes at night, and it was just a way to organize my thoughts, but I was ultimately encouraged by a thought leader in the area, Jed Black, who was at the time the director of the Stanford Sleep Medicine program. And he knew what kind of a sincere interest I had in understanding the medication. So we decided to start working on a paper together. And it took probably over a year and a half. But I started to amass, probably 1,000 different references that I had read and organized. And I ended up writing a paper for CNS Drugs, which is one of the most cited papers on the subject, which I'm really proud about. And it was a great learning experience in a lot of ways, honestly, not just about the drug, but even myself. And that's how it all really got started for me.
This was 10 years ago, and it's almost like 25 years ago now that GHB essentially was made unavailable to the general public, and that there was the date rape drug was everywhere in the news media, newspapers. I remember that from when I was a kid, and it was this big hubbubaloo for a while. So obviously this is a chemical with a pretty interesting history and some serious reputational problems. Can you sort of give us the historical rewind on GHB and some of its uses over time?
Yeah, sure. So it was first synthesized in the 60s. And actually the first paper that I found on it is from 1940s. And at the time, they thought they were developing a synthetic chemical that could act like GABA within the central nervous system, but have an easier time crossing the blood-brain barrier. It was soon after realized that it was actually produced endogenously. So GHB is an endogenous chemical. It's in most cells of the body, both peripherally and centrally. And also at that time, work in the lab showed that it had potent anesthetic properties. And so, particularly in Russia, it had been used as an anesthetic for a while. And it was then two researchers, Roger Broughton and Mort Mamelak, started to then evaluate it in intractable insomnia because they noticed during some of the earlier experiments that it would promote slow-wave sleep, which is very unique for a sleep medication. A lot of medications like this are sedatives, but they actually change your sleep architecture in a way that limits the robustness of deep sleep. And that's why we see where you might have slightly elongated sleep times with things like Ambien and other sedative hypnotics. You actually can have powerful and unfortunate impairments in memory and other issues that come along with those sorts of drugs too. So
they'll render you unconscious, but they won't necessarily promote your healthy sleep.
That's right. And for some people in a short term, they can be a good thing, but they're often misused. And like I said, they're an imperfect drug. So there was interest at the time to say, okay, well, if this drug can enhance slow-wave sleep, which it appears to do, maybe there's some utility there. So they started to look at it in intractable insomnia patients that had depression, and they found that it was beneficial. And that then gave rise to a very early clinical development program for looking at it in narcoleptic subjects. So narcolepsy is a condition which at that time, the mechanism for why narcolepsy develops was not known, but it has very bad clinically significant sleepiness during the day. So much so that where it can be extraordinarily dangerous for somebody with narcolepsy to be driving. You'll have what are called sleep attacks. So you feel alert and then you will just feel extremely sleepy to the point where you can not avoid it.
What % of the population is affected by narcolepsy?
So it varies around the world. The highest incidence in the population is in Japan, and that's about 0.1% of the population. The lowest incidence is in Israel. The US, it's about 0.005, so about 1 in 2,000 people. And it develops at all decades of life, but where it develops most frequently is in your teenage years. And we now know that, well, there's two different types of narcolepsy. There's narcolepsy with cataplexy, and there's narcolepsy without cataplexy. So cataplexy is an additional symptom where you have what is called bilateral, so both sides of the body, loss of muscle tone. And this happens when you have some sort of affective experience, meaning you have an emotional response to something, laughter during sex, all sorts of things that will evoke an emotional response. You will then become kind of partially paralyzed. It might be where the sentence "weak with laughter" comes from. And it can be really bad because it can be partial. So you have just a little sagging of the jaw or the limbs, but it can also be complete where somebody looks like the cord was pulled right out from their back and they just drop right to the floor. And so the treatment for narcolepsy and cataplexy is often the use of tricyclic antidepressants, which have never been tested rigorously, but have just been used off-label to help with that condition. And that was the awareness that tricyclics could be beneficial for cataplexy happened because a lot of people that have narcolepsy also experience depression. So they were given tricyclics to help with the depression, but then the cataplexy improved as well. But you also have something called rebound cataplexy, which if you go off of the medication, so if you go on it, it can help with your cataplectic attacks. It can reduce them. But eventually you develop something called tachyphylaxis to the medication, which means it becomes less effective over time. And then if you go off of the medication, you have what's called rebound cataplexy. So severe that people that have this might end up having to stay in bed for 2 or 3 days just to let their neurotransmitter systems resensitize, and so that they don't have such severe cataplexy that they can't even move. It's pretty devastating. So GHB came along and they noticed that it also reduced cataplexy. Originally, they were looking at it to just enhance the sleep. So one thing that we know about narcolepsy is that you have severe sleepiness during the day. What's also less known is that you can have highly disrupted sleep at night. A good way to think about narcolepsy is you sleep more like a cat. You know how cats, they'll take naps throughout the day and they're up at night. So they can't consolidate, or they don't consolidate all of their sleep into an 8-hour period and then they have 16 hours of wakefulness. They are asleep for a little bit, then they're up for a little bit. They're asleep for a little bit, then they're up for a little bit. And that's the same thing with narcoleptics. So narcoleptics don't necessarily sleep more than somebody that doesn't have narcolepsy, but their sleep and their wakefulness is basically bisected and spread out across the day. And that can be real problematic if you are trying to maintain a job and you have to take 3 naps during your job.
Do people with narcolepsy respond to sort of the normal triggers that help reset circadian rhythms, like blue wave light to help you wake up in the morning and things like that? Do they respond in the same way as people that are non-narcoleptics?
So what's missing in narcolepsy is a protein called hypocretin. And hypocretin, a good way to think of it, it acts like a symphony conductor sitting at the seat of your wake network. And your wake network is made up of a group of different neurotransmitter systems, including serotonin in the dorsal raphe, histamine in the tuberomammillary nucleus, dopamine, norepinephrine, and additional glutamatergic transmission in the reticular activating system. So there's all these different groups of neurotransmitters spread throughout the brain that together will promote cortical activity associated with consciousness. And at the seat of that is hypocretin. And so hypocretin is almost telling them, okay, you know what, it's daytime, play, be on. And at nighttime, the activity hypocretin diminishes, and also that reduces the signal for this wake network to be active. So the circadian rhythm link is that light comes into the eye, and through what are called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells, which are basically like rods and cones in the retina, but actually are in a different part of the retina. They'll communicate to the master clock via something called the retinal hypothalamic tract, and it'll say, okay, hey, it's daytime. That will then communicate to other parts of the hypothalamus to let other parts of the hypothalamus know, okay, yeah, it's daytime, do daytime activities, including the lateral hypothalamic neurons, which contain hypocretin. And so when you're missing hypocretin, you can have a functioning circadian clock in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, but that signal is not getting transduced appropriately. And so, yes, other parts of the circadian system can be functioning just fine, but the alertness mechanisms and the coordination of consolidated wakefulness is impaired.
Gotcha. Great answer.
One of the abilities of hypocretin is to consolidate wakefulness across the day. Another aspect of its function is to then help to consolidate sleep at night. And so narcoleptics, again, end up being more like a cat in that they can only maintain wakefulness for a certain amount of time, and then they can only maintain sleep for a certain amount of time before they wake back up. And so pharmacologic therapies have been evaluated to say, and this includes a lot of the amphetamine salts, to try to say, okay, can we then counteract this inability to extend wakefulness by using pharmacological measures? But there's a lot of downsides to that, as you can imagine. Narcoleptics take very high doses of amphetamines, and it still does not completely address all of the sleepiness that they have. I mean, methamphetamine is actually a pharmacological agent that is sometimes used in the treatment of narcolepsy, just because sleepiness can be that severe.
Yeah, they're pulling out the big guns at that point.
Yeah, completely. It's an imperfect solution for people that have narcolepsy to just use that. And generally, hypnotics like Ambien don't work very well at all in people that have narcolepsy. So I think what ends up happening is the amphetamine salts can do okay for a little while, but again, nothing is going to replace the need for sleep. Absolutely nothing. It can help you perform better under conditions of sleep loss for some period of time, but ultimately that's going to catch up with you. So there's all these parallel stories that are taking place with GHB. One of them is this identification that, wow, this could be a very novel sleep medication for people that have insomnia, and actually this might also work in narcolepsy. And that started these early investigations into people that have narcolepsy with GHB. At the same time, it was also widely available in the 80s. It became widely available in health food stores. And so some of the early work showed that GHB can influence the release of growth hormone. And it might actually be a direct secretagogue, meaning that GHB might directly stimulate the release of growth hormone. At first, it was identified that when you take GHB at night, it will enhance slow wave sleep. During slow wave sleep, that is the time when you produce most of your growth hormone during a 24-hour period. And what happens is that the pulse of growth hormone the amplitude is doubled. And then also the time in which growth hormone is being produced is also elongated. And so you can have a doubling of the amount of growth hormone in response to the appropriate dose of GHB at night. That is how it was originally used. People would take it to sleep and they'd get more growth hormone produced. Then a study came out that showed that growth hormone could be released even if the subject was not sleeping. And that made researchers think, okay, well, maybe it's not just that it's enhancing slow wave sleep, which is the period where growth hormone is usually released, but it's actually, again, having a direct impact on the pituitary gland to release it. And bodybuilders got hold of this information and said, okay, great, well, I can just take GHB multiple times throughout the day and I'm going to increase the amount of growth hormone that I'm producing. And what we'll find out later is that we also know that GHB has abuse potential and has been shown to induce withdrawal syndrome if you stop taking it, if you take it enough. But it's not necessarily the quantity that you take per day. It's the frequency of administration that's really problematic. If you're essentially not giving your receptors that it's binding to, and we could talk about that, a chance to rest, then you can really desensitize them, and that's going to cause hyperexcitability downstream. And we've seen that, and that can be, really problematic for people.
What are the effects like when somebody has become addicted and then tries to wean themselves off it?
It's not dissimilar to alcohol withdrawal. So you'll have agitation, you'll feel physically uncomfortable. Essentially what you've been doing when you take GHB with enough frequency, consecutive days in a row, we don't know exactly what that number is, but let's say it's 5 times a day. For the earliest report showed somebody started to manifest withdrawal symptoms after only 7 days of usage. Previously, the report before that showed it was at least 2 months, but most people in the literature prior to that had been on taking it for maybe 6 months at a time before they started to develop a real serious issue. It's very similar to alcohol withdrawal. Interestingly, GHB has also been shown to be therapeutic for people suffering from alcohol withdrawal. So you replace GHB for alcohol when somebody's trying to get off alcohol, and it can help reduce some of the symptoms.
Interesting. And one of the reasons that people might be taking it with great frequency is because the effects are pretty acute.
That's right. So the half-life of the drug is 37 minutes. And that's one of the problems with dosing at night for narcolepsy is that patients, they have to take it at bedtime, and then they'll take it 4 hours later. And not only will sodium oxybate at the right dose, or GHB at the right dose, promote sleep, but then it can also promote a middle of the night arousal. And some of the mechanisms there are pretty interesting if you think about what's actually happening at neurotransmitter systems. GHB is working on a lot of different systems within the brain. And actually, I should maybe even start by talking about what is the drug itself, and maybe we can then kind of circle back and talk about how it was banned. So GHB actually fulfills all the criteria for being a neurotransmitter itself. And it's stored in vesicles. It has a release mechanism, a reuptake mechanism, and even binding sites or receptors have been identified. And we call them binding sites because we're not sure if they really do act as a neurotransmitter, although there is evidence that it has basically discrete effects. It appears that most of the pharmacological effects of GHB are not happening because of it binding to a GHB receptor. Most of the effects are happening because it's binding to GABA B receptors, and that only really happens when you're taking pharmacological doses. So what is the endogenous effect of circulating GHB? Why is it there? What is it doing? Hard to tell. It might be affecting metabolism. We see high levels in hibernating bears. We know GHB is gamma hydroxybutyrate. It's a short chain fatty acid. It's a ketone. So, right now ketogenesis through dietary means is really popular. Beta hydroxybutyrate is one of the really interesting ketones that is developed that might have influence on hypothalamic centers or centers of the brain that are influencing body weight regulation. And so it's an interesting story, and not sure what GHB is doing endogenously, but when we take pharmacological doses, you can induce supraphysiologic or higher than what you see within the body concentrations. And when you do that, then it's going to have a whole different panoply of effects within the central nervous system.
What is sort of the multiplier there on the amount that might be sort of at a baseline level in a normal human body versus what people are taking, either the weightlifters in the 1980s taking it for physical health reasons, or the people that are being prescribed it for narcolepsy?
You'll see GHB in concentrations of 1 to 2 micromolar within the central nervous system, but you'll need to see concentrations of greater than 150 micromolar when you take these very high doses of GHB. And so the majority of the effects, again, happen when you induce these super physiologic concentrations. And when you do, you start to then bind to GABA B receptors throughout the central nervous system. And so at the right concentration, GHB can also be excitatory. And like alcohol, it can disinhibit neurons within the central nervous system that can then make you feel, it's very similar to the effects of alcohol, but unique as well. So it can induce prosocial behavior. It is thought to be an entactogenic agent, which means that it can, increase the desire for being touched and to, just feel more kind of connected with people. That's very similar to MDMA. And actually, it's why it's even been called liquid ecstasy. And so I think I just accidentally introduced the third line here. So we've got bodybuilders are taking it for physical benefit. Narcoleptics are taking it to help with excessive daytime sleepiness and with cataplexy and also to help with their sleep. And now there's also some awareness that it might actually feel good, like a drug of abuse, when you take it at the right concentration. So when you take a lower concentration, that's going to cause some of this disinhibition, which then is going to be related to excitation. Again, very similar to alcohol. And when you take more, then you're going to have a higher concentration, which can bind more aggressively to GABA B receptors. And that's actually one of the problems when people use this as a club drug. There's a dose response in terms of the pleasant feelings that people get up until a certain point. And then when you take a little bit more, you now have a sufficient concentration to bind to these GABA B receptors, and it knocks you out. It was a real problem as this drug was easy to get. It was very easy to get. You could get it at health food stores once that was limited. So there was the DEA placed a ban on it in 1990. And then this kind of started more of an underground, marketplace for people to try to get it. So they were selling precursors to the drug. So gamma-butyrolactone, 1,4-butanediol. These are industrial solvents that are used in mass quantity that convert to GHB once consumed. So obviously there's a lot of issues there. These products are all not made for human consumption. There could be a lot of impurities there that can cause, like any sort of, drug that's made on the street. And that really confounded things as well. So the DEA was really trying to crack down on that. There was another kind of political movement that was saying, hey, this is used as the date rape drug. So Rohypnol, which is a long-acting benzodiazepine that causes retrograde amnesia, which means that you're going to forget 15 hours before you took the pill. You're not going to record memories for that amount of time. That was called commonly roofies, and people could slip that into a drink, and it was, again, it became the date rape drug. When the DEA cracked down on that, GHB started to be used in a similar capacity. It could be slipped into a drink, and people wouldn't know it, and then that could alter somebody's behavior. So it kind of unfairly acquired a lot of the reputation of Rohypnol, but because it acted very, very differently. It wasn't this long-acting drug that would keep you unarousable for 12 hours and then also make you forget 15 hours before that. And so a large group of people really started to then try to crack down and say, listen, this is a very dangerous drug. It needs to be not accessible in any format. So now you had basically two groups of people, like legitimate groups that were saying, all right, well, no, we need this medication for the treatment of narcolepsy. And then another group that was saying, no, this can't be provided to anybody because it could get out. You know what happens with medications that gets out of people's hands. And that conversation lasted a while, and it required a lot of stakeholders to come to the table, explain their points of view. And ultimately, the FDA decided to go forward and create a very strict system for which sodium oxybate, or the sodium salt of GHB, could be in the form of something called Xyrem, so that's the trade name, was delivered by a central pharmacy with very tight controls to people that had a diagnosis of narcolepsy. Doctors can write off-label prescriptions, but the drug is also very costly. And, a doctor can prescribe any drug according to how they see fit if they feel that medication can help somebody with a condition.
That's interesting. So basically back during the time that it was available in health food stores and things like that, I assume it wasn't prohibitively costly then, but when it became a regulated drug that can only be gotten through doctors, at that point the price just jacked up?
Yeah. that was, I think, part of the program, maybe if not even stated explicitly, to then limit its distribution to make the cost really high. So insurance companies will pay for somebody that has narcolepsy, but they're not going to pay for, something that is less, I guess, what they considered required for its usage. But it can be used for anything. It's been tested in a case study fashion for a lot of different things. So ultimately, my job became for a company, Jazz Pharmaceuticals, which acquired Orphan Medical, which is the first company I worked for. I ran a research grant program. And so what I did is I set up a mechanism by which academic investigators could then submit a proposal to get either funding, drug, or data to then do research upon. And these would be unrestricted grants that the company would provide, which means we wouldn't provide any input except on safety. And otherwise, they could just say, okay, well, I want to test to see if this drug has any utility in ameliorating symptoms of Parkinson's, because there are so many different conditions that are in some way affected by poor sleep as a component of that condition, particularly neurological conditions. Every psychiatric condition, depression, anxiety, et cetera, all of them have some sort of aberrant sleep profile that is maybe not unique, but is off from people that are not affected by any sort of psychiatric condition. At one point, we had almost 30 different trials that we were funding, and it ranged from looking at, does the medication have an influence on things like longevity in C. elegans? Does it affect essential tremor? Does it affect fibromyalgia? Does it affect Parkinsonian symptoms? And so it was a fascinating time of my life because I was getting to interact with all these different thought leaders that were top in their field in, again, Parkinson's syndrome. And then them saying, I understand how the mechanism of action works for GHB and how it's different. And I'm curious to see if it actually helps to benefit, my patients. At the time, we started to do a clinical development program for the use of sodium oxybate in fibromyalgia patients. And pregabalin was approved. Cymbalta was approved. These are some other medications to help treat fibromyalgia symptoms. One characteristic symptom of fibromyalgia patients is really unrestorative, poor sleep. So they get sleep, they feel very sleepy, but they never feel restored by it. There's a lot of theories about what's going on there. Maybe something called alpha delta sleep, where you have a wake-like brain rhythm overlaying deeper sleep. So it ends up not being, you don't get the sleep that you really need. The brain isn't able to do what it needs to restore itself. Anyway, there's all these different possibilities about why somebody feels really sleepy the next day. But sodium oxybate, when we tested it up to phase 3 clinical trials, performed really well. But then an FDA advisory committee voted it down 22-1. And I think there was a lot of nerves around now expanding a population, which is a total of 200,000 in the United States in narcoleptics, to 5 million people in the United States, and what that might mean in terms of overall availability of the drug.
So it sounds like the downsides are sort of secondary effects, like you fall asleep and somebody takes advantage of you or something like that. Not necessarily that there's a lethal dose that's anywhere close to what would be a therapeutic dose.
The toxicological profile for this is you have to take a lot of this stuff in order for it to be a real problem, or at least in order for it to kill you. But you want to be very careful with what else you have on board, meaning like you never want to drink with GHB. You never want to take more than one sedative or hypnotic at the same time, any sort of central nervous system depressant. I actually know several people within the Bay Area where I'm from who have died, and it was from taking GHB and also taking Ambien at the same time. One person, I don't remember his name, sadly, it was probably 12 years ago or so, but I think he had taken a transcontinental flight and landed, taken Ambien on the flight and then couldn't sleep and then took GHB and didn't wake up. So there's one thing called positional associated asphyxiation. So if somebody falls asleep and they're in a position where, that you can't breathe, then that has been the cause of death in some people that have died from it.
Yeah, I've read that with alcohol, one of the problems there is if you're drunk and then you vomit, and because of the GHB that might be in your system, you are in sort of an unrousable sleep. You can just kind of choke on your own vomit because the choking isn't enough to wake you.
Yep, that's right. That could be a problem, obviously, as well. And it can induce nausea and headache. So in clinical studies, nausea and headache are basically the two side effects that occur with the highest frequency. Interestingly, the pharmacovigilance department at Jazz Pharmaceuticals, one of the highest, most frequently reported adverse events or events was weight loss. And sometimes the weight loss would be so severe where the person would have to go off of the medication because they became underweight. This was something that was very interesting in its early usage, its ability to induce weight loss. And it was thought that perhaps a lot of the effects were coming from the secretory effects of GHB on growth hormone. And growth hormone has then an effect on hormone-sensitive lipase, which can affect fat metabolism. You also basically see is a variety of these wake neurotransmitters get deactivated when GHB is within the system, but then there is a hyperactivation or a rebound activation when on washout of GHB. So if you take it at night and it helps you sleep, and then during the day, you might be in this, a bad way to say it is a mini withdrawal, but you're essentially kind of heightening the sensitivity of these neurotransmitter systems. The effects on dopamine, for example, are really, really interesting. What you basically see is that when it's active in the system, you have increased storage of dopamine. And then again, you have more dopamine available upon washout. And so the way that it does is it'll actually inhibit the release of dopamine when it's present in the system in adequate concentrations. It'll also increase its synthesis, and it does this by inhibiting what's called end product inhibition. And so if you think about common biochemical pathways, end product inhibition means that the end product of a biochemical pathway will inhibit the rate limiting enzyme that is kind of converting substrates into that product. And so with dopamine, the rate-limiting enzyme is tyrosine hydroxylase, which converts tyrosine, the amino acid, into L-DOPA, which is then the precursor to dopamine. So typically, if you have enough dopamine there, dopamine is going to shut down the activity of tyrosine hydroxylase, and you're not going to produce more. But GHB seems to interfere with that process, so you end up producing more dopamine than you really would, and this kind of supercharges your dopamine neurons. And then when you wake up, you have more dopamine available. So it can have a little bit of an alerting effect. And the way that I relate this to weight loss is that, all right, so you have some effects on growth hormone, but you also might have better energy the next day, so you're more physically active. And actually, that is what sodium oxybate, or GHB, is approved for in narcolepsy. It wasn't approved to help people sleep, even though you take it at night. Originally, it was approved because it would help with excessive daytime sleepiness of narcolepsy. So it was acting like a stimulant, but it was doing so in a very robust capacity. So the way that you test sleepiness during the day is you give somebody an overnight polysomnography test, which is a multiple measures of sleep. And then during the day, you do something called an MWT or an MSLT. So it's a maintenance of wakefulness test. So every 2 hours, you'll say, okay, sit in this chair in a dimly lit room in a slightly reclined chair and try to stay awake for 20 minutes. And your ability to do that is tested. Or you do a multiple sleep latency test where every 2 hours you have somebody lie completely supine in a dark room and you say, try to sleep. And basically, narcoleptics have a very poor ability to stay awake in either one of those scenarios. And GHB is even more effective than modafinil, which is another drug that is approved for narcolepsy at promoting wakefulness. One of the reasons there is that it's kind of supercharging these wake-related neurotransmitters.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So first, I gotta say, that one, it kind of bums me out a little. It seems like that is such an interesting and potentially useful and beneficial drug, especially with all the problems that people have in society with sleep. Those of us who are not narcoleptics, there's still some giant benefits that could be had society-wide if we were more readily able to get into deep, healthy, sustained sleep. The sense I get is that we're sort of throwing a very valuable baby out with the bathwater in making this stuff as difficult as it currently is to get a hold of. But thank you so very, very much to Dan Pardi for taking the time to explicate all of that for us. I was super thrilled to find out that Dan is a listener to this podcast. That's another email that will be printed out and put up on my refrigerator under a magnet so I can feel warm fuzzies every time I walk into the kitchen. I really appreciate that when people reach out and let me know, hey, I like the podcast, and by the way, this is what I'm doing. So thanks again to Dan, and definitely check out dansplan.com. He blogs over there about all sorts of stuff related to physical health, exercise, diet, nutrition, lifestyle, sort of the foundational elements, the things that are really at the core of being healthy and having effective cognition. Hopefully needless to say, but nevertheless always worth repeating, all the smart drugs in the world are not necessarily going to get you where you want to go cognitively if you have severely compromised physical health baselines. Or to paraphrase in the words of one of my friend's fathers while growing up, you can't polish a turd. Ew! But places like dansplan.com give lots of great information on baseline physical health stuff, well worth checking out, highly recommended. But now, for something far less good for your health, the Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless Listener Retention Gimmick.
So if you've been listening to this show for a while, you know that I'm one of these stodgy stick-in-the-mud types that doesn't drink alcohol, and every couple of episodes I'll say something passive-aggressively disparaging about alcohol. But I saw this article. I thought this sounded awesome. This is a method of alcohol administration, which I'd never heard of before, and I just think this was clever. So maybe I can earn back some of my curmudgeonly points by bringing this one to people's attention. If you're in London, there's a bar called Alcoholic Architecture. The building used to be an old monastery, and now it's all decked out in neon and looks all loungy and cool, but what's really interesting about it is the way that they serve alcohol there, which is not in the form of drinks. The entire bar is filled with a thick alcoholic mist that you actually breathe in. And so the alcohol, it's not like it's condensing in your mouth and you're still drinking it anyway. You're actually taking in the alcohol through your lungs, so it's getting into your bloodstream and eventually to your brain faster. They keep the alcohol in the air at a concentration, so basically being in this bar for about an hour is about the equivalent to one strong drink. They keep the place at 140% humidity. The air is sort of beating with alcohol, and the visibility is generally only about 3 feet. According to the bar owners, taking in alcohol in this way is not giving people hangovers, so the next day is more pleasant than it might be at a typical bar. What I wonder is what people do with their hands at a bar where they're not serving drinks and presumably nobody's smoking, because I would think that they wouldn't allow smoking in a bar where the atmosphere is the entire point. The taste of what you're breathing is apparently a smoky-tasting, frankincense-infused gin. And somewhat surprisingly, it doesn't sound like they have different flavors in different rooms. It's sort of a one-size-fits-all alcoholic atmosphere. But yeah, if you're looking for interesting bars in London, maybe check that one out.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Okay, that is the entire episode number 90 coming in for a landing. Thank you for hanging around until the end. If you enjoyed this podcast, please tell some friends if you got some friends handy. Tell some family members if you got some of those handy. And if you got nobody handy, well, A, you should go out and make some friends or start a family. But if that sounds like too much work, you could always head over to iTunes and leave a positive review for Smart Drug Smarts, because that helps too. Nice reviews keep us bumped up in the iTunes search algorithm rankings and help more people find out about us. And that is something that we really, really appreciate. And for those of you wondering what's coming down the pike next at Smart Drug Smarts as far as future episodes, content that's maybe a couple of weeks away from actually hitting the podcast airwaves, I started doing something a week or so ago, which I think I'm going to keep with, which is when I finish an interview with somebody who is going to be a guest on the show, I'm just recording a couple of minutes while the interview is fresh in my mind. It's going to be like a combination of a preview for the episode and also some notes to our audio editor on things he might want to keep a careful lookout for and make sure that they make it into the episode and don't wind up on the cutting room floor. We're going to be posting those up on YouTube, so there will be like a minute or two maybe about forthcoming episodes, and then we'll eventually link those up to the podcast episodes as they publish. So if you're a YouTube person and if you're such a diehard Smart Drug Smarts fan that you want to know what's coming out before it does come out, then that is one way to do it. The show notes for this episode will be online at smartdrugsmarts.com, including the links to everything that we discussed here. And I'll be back at you next week, same time, same podcast, and with the same unflagging commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.